Boldwood presents Dreaming Under an Island Skye, written by Lisa Hobman and read by Ailey Beaton. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Prologue. Through gritted teeth, Juliette cursed the Victorian architect who'd had the monumentally stupid idea of utilising every inch of the high-ceilinged room for storage. If they'd been subject to health and safety regulations back then, there's no way ladder access to shelves that were ridiculously high in her opinion would have been allowed. Although it was a stunning library, with its ornately carved oak posts and arches, it was simply not practical anymore. In fact, she couldn't imagine it being practical back in 1873, when it was originally constructed. But, of course, the University of Gloucestershire was proud of its heritage, and rightly so, Juliette reasoned. Who was she to demand changes but a 26-year-old former student turned librarian? This wasn't how she was expecting to spend her day, that was for sure. Clinging precariously to the location where she had just replaced copies of The Modern Judge. Her fingers ached and her toes were going numb as she clung on for dear life and tried to formulate a plan. She could jump, but as there was probably 15 feet between her and the floor, that would possibly result in bone breakages, muscle sprains, or, worst-case scenario, death. Her alternative was to hold on and either, 1, shout for help, or 2, simply hope it manifested by chance sooner rather than later. Friday lunchtime was usually Juliette's favourite time in the library. It was the one time of the week when no students were allowed in and the librarians were able to catch up on restocking the shelves with returned books. To be surrounded by millions of pages of knowledge just waiting to be soaked up. And oh, the bibliosmia. Was there a better smell anywhere in the world than old books? There were usually at least 2 members of staff, but today, typically, her boss Nancy had gone home ill and her colleague Claire was on holiday, meaning Juliette was alone. All alone. Completely by herself. Which would be fine if she wasn't stuck up a bookcase, sans ladder, wearing a floaty skirt. Bloody typical. Anger and embarrassment heated her skin in equal measure as she realised the security guards would have a field day if they watched back the footage of this utter debacle. She could imagine it now. The 2 main ones, Bill and Ben, as Juliette liked to call them, sitting there in front of the surveillance screens, a mug of some steaming brew resting on each rotund belly as they stuffed biscuits into their gobs. Then she imagined crumbs spraying everywhere as they were overcome with the hilarity of watching the ladder fall, leaving Juliette dangling from the top shelf of the law reference section like something off bloody You've Been Framed. She was still unsure how the attached ladder had become detached and had fallen to the floor, leaving her stranded and terrified. She would have serious words with the caretaker, or, if anything bad was to happen, she'd be haunting the rat bag. Those things were certain. What wasn't certain, however, was how she was going to circumvent the small issue of the 15 feet of air between her current location and the floor. The lack of space at the edges of the lower shelves annoyed her. Nancy had obviously been tidying again. The woman had an aversion to spacing, and each book was butted up to the edge, as well as being tightly packed in, making it virtually impossible to retrieve anything in order to use it. But, more importantly now, it meant Juliette was unable to find a foothold. So, climbing down isn't an option, she huffed. The door to the library gave the familiar high-pitched squeak as it was pushed open, and Juliette closed her eyes. She couldn't see the door from where she was, but she prayed it wasn't one of the obnoxious new caretaking teams she'd encountered in recent weeks. If it was, she could be sure this would all end up on YouTube with a gazillion views, meaning she wouldn't dare show her face in public again. She held her breath for a moment and listened intently for noises that would indicate the identity of the visitor. When none came, she opened her eyes and cleared her throat. Ahem. Hello? Who's there, please? She shouted, with as much dignity as her situation would allow. There was a pause, and then...
It's Laurie. Professor Fairhurst. Lawrence.
Oh, shit. It just had to be him, didn't it? She had nursed a secret crush on the gorgeous yet shy man since the day she had started work at the university a year before and first laid eyes on him. The resemblance he bore to Superman from the DC movies wasn't lost on her. She had noticed the lack of a wedding ring and had tried on so many occasions to pluck up the courage to speak to him, to actually have a conversation that wasn't work-related. But, up to that point, the courage she sought had evaded her. And, much to her dismay, their relationship had been solely based on professional politeness and courtesy when he came to sign out a research book for his latest thesis. She squeezed her eyes shut again, and she called out, "Professor Fairhurst, it's Juliette. I'm one of the librarians," in case he didn't remember her. "This is rather embarrassing, but could you possibly come to the law reference section, please? I'm in a bit of a pickle."
"Sure, on my way."
From the speed of his footsteps, he'd evidently sensed the urgency in her voice. A couple of seconds later, she opened her eyes and turned her head slowly to find the handsome English professor staring up at her in bemusement. As always, he was immaculately presented in a tweed jacket, pressed shirt, and coordinating tie, smart trousers, and matching waistcoat. His dark hair was parted to the side and swept back in that Clark Kent way, and she tried her best not to swoon. He shook his head.
"How? I mean, why?"
From the way he held his hand over his mouth, it was clear he was trying not to laugh. Great.
"Hang on, am I supposed to recite Shakespeare to you at this point, Juliette?"
He gave in to the laughter he'd been holding back. Anger flared inside her, and her cheeks, by now, she guessed, would be a delightful shade of scarlet. "It's not a laughing matter, Professor Fairhurst," she snapped. His face squirmed and contorted into an expression of solemnity.
No, you're right. I apologise.
And please, call me Lawrence. Now, what exactly has happened?"
"Well, Lawrence, I think the ladder fixing is broken. The ladder fell when I reached across to grasp it and—"
She didn't need to finish the sentence. Lawrence dashed to the offending article and lifted it up to rest beside her. But the top section was broken in two.
"Ah, yes. It appears to have broken further in the fall. We can't risk you climbing on it." "OK."
Juliette prayed that her footless tights were not the ones with a hole under her left buttock that she'd meant to throw out. If they were, the professor was getting an eyeful. He took off his jacket and rolled up his sleeves, then scratched his chin and glanced at his surroundings, seemingly trying to formulate a plan.
"Right, OK."
He returned his attention to her and pursed his lips as he appraised her, hanging there. She was on the verge of pointing out the fact that time was of the essence when he spoke again.
"You're quite small, really, which means I can easily catch you. I'm pretty sure I can."
Juliette scowled down at him, and with a distinct wobble to her voice, she said,
In spite of your positive assertion, the delivery of it leads me to believe the contrary."
He squared his broad shoulders and took a wide, arms-open stance beneath her.
No, I can do it. Just be sure to push off the shelf so you don't hit yourself on the way down. I'm ready when you are."
She gulped.
"If anything, bad happens, my diary and my phone are in my bag, which is under the main desk. My emergency contacts are in both." "Nothing bad is going to happen, I promise."
She peered down at him and saw sincerity in his beautiful eyes. Eyes that she had longed to gaze into ever since she first laid hers on him. He smiled.
"I promise I won't tell everyone you fell for me."
His smile turned into a grin, but it quickly disappeared as if he realised he had been rather inappropriate.
"I mean, I didn't—"
He appeared to be scrabbling around his mind for the words to undo his comment, and blurted,
"I'll take you to the refectory for a cake when you're down here, shall I?"
His colour drained, telling her he felt he'd made the situation worse.
"I only mean because sugar helps with shock, I've been led to believe."
Her heart melted at his awkwardness, and she thought to herself, "You can tell everyone I've fallen for you. It is the truth, after all." Instead, she said, "I'm holding you to that offer of cake," in the hope it would let him know she wasn't offended.
"Great! I'm quite partial to death by chocolate."
He cringed again, and she guessed it was at his mention of death. He clearly chose not to dwell on his faux pas.
"Now, come on, before they run out."
She nodded with determination.
"OK, I'm letting go now."
She took a deep breath and released her grip on the shelves. Chapter 1. 8 years later. Why the hell didn't I drive into town? Why the hell did I come in the first place? Stupid, stupid woman. Why didn't I realise going on a date was a mistake of epic proportions? Juliette pondered the answers to these, and many other questions, as she hid in the alleyway beside the upmarket restaurant. She'd given up wiping at her eyes now. The icy rain that battered against her skin mingled with her tears, so no one would even realise she was crying. Not that anyone could see her. The walls surrounding her were shielding her from public view, but doing nothing to protect her from the deluge. For goodness sake, she couldn't even hide properly. Every time she thought of the confused expression on Peter's face and the way he glanced around in embarrassment as she completely lost it, her own face crumpled again. What the hell must he have thought? The poor, poor man. He hadn't asked to date a neurotic, snivelling loony. He hadn't asked for his date to freak out before the food was even ordered. But then again, Juliette hadn't asked to be a widow at the age of 34. A breeze whipped its way down the alley, curling around her bare legs, causing her to wrap her arms tighter around her body and ruffling her freshly straightened, mousy brown hair. So much for spring. Earlier in the evening, she had stood before her full-length mirror, but the reflection staring back was one she hardly recognised. Gone were the curves she had owned proudly when Laurie was with her. Gone were the bright eyes filled with hope and happiness. Now she was gaunt, pale, and clothing that had once clung in all the right places hung shapelessly from her fragile-looking frame. As she had rifled through her wardrobe, the only thing that had seemed suitable for a night out was her little flimsy summer dress. It hadn't appeared to be such a problem when the sunshine had cast a merry gleam over everything outside her bedroom window. Her long, natural waves had been tamed with a straightening iron, and she had even applied a little blush and lip gloss to detract from the bizarre glow her almost translucent skin cast. "I look like a bloody vampire," she had whinged as she stared into the eyes of the woman in the mirror. Her best friend Millie was having none of her negativity. "You look absolutely stunning, Jules. Peter will almost certainly fall for you. And if he doesn't, he's gay and in serious denial." Now, though, standing outside in the alley in the pouring rain, Juliette felt like a complete and utter arse. Not only was her dress inappropriate for the inclement weather that had descended, but she had made a total fool of herself on her first date since Laurie had died 2 years ago. Who the hell has a meltdown over the bloody wine list? Of course, it was nothing whatsoever to do with the wine list, but Peter wasn't to know that. Nor were the nosy buggers sitting on the other tables. Oh, the judgment in their eyes, the pity, and the amusement too. She'd be the talk of Mistford, no doubt, when the news reached there. Her whole body juddered as she dialed Millie's number. She wasn't sure if the shaking was due to the Icelandic blast surrounding her, or the utter shock of what had just happened, or, more to the point, what she had allowed to happen. She was crazy to think she could make such a bold step. In fact, she was verging on idiotic to think she was anywhere near ready to do such a thing. More tears fell as Millie answered her call. "Hey, honey. Why are you calling so early? I thought you'd be—" "Please, Millie, can you come and get me? I just can't. He was—" She sobbed, and her words became inaudible blubs and mumbles. "Juliette, why are you crying?" Millie only ever used her full name when she was peed off or worried. "You're at Alessandro's, right?" "Yes," Juliette managed to reply, and she prepared to explain as briefly as possible. "You see—" "Stay there. I'll get to you as soon as I can." The words rushed out, and Juliette could hear the urgency in her best friend's voice. There was definitely conclusion jumping afoot. Damn it, she needs to know. But before Juliette could respond, or more importantly, explain the situation, the line went dead. Millie would be in a blind panic now. All manner of terrible things would be going through her mind about what Peter had done to upset her so much. Shitty shit. God, why am I such a drama queen? She slumped against the wall and let her head fall back onto the wet bricks. She clamped her eyes shut and fought the frustrated scream threatening to escape from her throat. The evening really hadn't gone according to plan. Juliette gripped the silver locket with the robin engraved on the front that always stayed round her neck, a gift from Laurie, and wished she could simply turn back the clock. The short journey to Millie's was reasonably calm, apart from the initial barrage of questions. Did he insult you? And did he smell? And finally, did he hurt you? Because if he did, I'll make earrings from his... No, nothing at all like that. He was the perfect gentleman. Well, we'll get you back to mine, and you can tell me all about it. You can drop me at home. I'm fine, honestly, Juliette insisted. You forget how long I've known you. You're clearly very shaken, so you're coming home with me. No arguments. Juliette didn't protest any further. There was no point. Millie was very protective over her since Laurie's death, and she was grateful to have such a loving friend on her side. Milly and Juliette had been friends since the first day at university, when, like a fish out of water, Juliette found herself in Gloucestershire to embark upon the next stage of her life, studying English and creative writing. It was a far cry from the little village outside the northeastern city of Durham where she'd grown up, and the moment she walked into orientation, she wondered if she had made a huge mistake moving so far from home. Any worry was short-lived, however, when a well-spoken, smiley blonde girl had informed her, "I'm Milly. You and I are going to be best friends. I can just feel it." And had subsequently linked arms with her and given her a squeeze. They had been virtually inseparable ever since. Over the years since leaving university, Juliette becoming employed in the library there, and Milly beginning a career in marketing, the friends had grown so close they considered each other as family. They'd shared student digs and then a rented house, the house where Milly still lived and ran her freelance business from, in fact. Juliette wasn't sure how she would have coped without her since losing Laurie. Once they were back at Milly's and Juliette was dried off, she stepped into the coziness of a pair of her friends' fleece pyjamas. The picture on the front was a cartoon chicken wearing a nightcap, and the slogan read, "It's mother-clucking bedtime." She couldn't help giggling as she thought about Milly's obsession with pyjamas. For most women, it's shoes and handbags. Not Milly. Give her a cute pair of PJs, and she was as happy as a pig in poop. In fact, she probably had a pair with that very slogan on. When Juliette walked back into the living area, she found Milly sitting curled up on the sofa, wineglass in hand. She too wore pyjamas, but hers were accompanied by an expectant expression. She patted the seat beside her. "Come on, I've poured you a glass. Tell me what happened." Juliette plonked herself down and picked up her glass. She took a large gulp of the ruby-red liquid before recanting the events of the evening. Alessandro's was the best Italian restaurant in the area. It was a quaint former pub that was located on the main street of Bourton-on-the-Water, the next village to her home of Mistford, and overlooking the River Windrush. Fairy lights were strewn across the exterior, and Italian music drifted out of the open doors. Their homemade pasta was to die for, and their desserts orgasmic. She and Laurie had eaten there on numerous occasions over the years, and it held many happy memories for Juliette. Mistake number 2, after accepting the original offer of a date, had been agreeing to meet there. She'd recently met her date, Peter Wilsden, through her colleague Claire, a happily married mum of 2. Her husband was a high school PE teacher, and Peter was his divorced colleague. The photo of him on the school website, eagerly displayed to her by Claire, showed a fairly handsome man with cropped dark hair and smiley eyes. He wasn't drop-dead gorgeous, but Juliette knew better than to expect perfection again after having it once with Laurie. He was a science teacher, and apparently a really lovely man who had been through a tough divorce the same year that Laurie had lost his battle with cancer. They had exchanged phone calls and emails, and things seemed to be going swimmingly. So, when he suggested dinner, she couldn't think of an excuse why she shouldn't go. She tried to come up with reasons, but none made much sense, and were all down to her own insecurities. It was strange to be back out there, and Juliette still had niggles of doubt in the back of her mind. But she knew she didn't want to be single for the rest of her life, and even Laurie had made her promise she would move on. Admittedly, at 34, the prospect of being alone forever was daunting. But not quite as daunting as meeting someone new. The date had been set, And Juliette had done the obligatory internet searches to make sure Peter Wilsden wasn't a wanted, axe-murdering psychopath disguised as a science teacher. But as nothing had come up, she figured he was either not a criminal or he was an extremely good one that hadn't been caught yet. Millie had encouraged her to agree to his offer of dinner. "You never know, Jules. This might just be the one." Of course, she'd had to pull her up there. She'd had her shot at the one, and he died after 3 wonderful years of marriage. Following her return to work and the realisation that she would never see Laurie in her library again, grief had descended into clinical depression, and it had taken a lot to get to where she was now. She was quietly proud of herself and grateful for the help she'd had to come through the other side, but she knew there was still a long way to go, and meeting Peter may just be the next step on that journey, she'd figured. Dinner was arranged for the last Saturday in May, and Millie had come around to help her get ready. Although the help had consisted of copious cups of tea and, "Oh, can I borrow this frock, Jules? And this top? Ooh, and these shoes." Juliette had arrived at Alessandro's a few minutes late, on purpose. There would be nothing worse than arriving early and appearing desperate. The maitre d' had shown her to the table, but as she had approached it, she'd felt a little uneasy. The man sitting at the table was almost the spitting image of Laurie. How had she not noticed this before? Was this her mind playing tricks on her now that she was taking the first brave steps towards moving on? The more she watched him as she walked, the more she tried to see past the initial similarities. He wasn't Laurie, and that was that. However, a niggle in the back of her mind insisted that, from the hairstyle to the clothes, he could have been Laurie's twin. Except for the fact Peter wasn't wearing glasses, that was something at least. If he'd worn spectacles, the man would have been a doppelganger for sure, and she wouldn't have coped with that at all. He greeted her with a kiss to both cheeks, very fancy, and had even pulled out her chair. A whiff of his aftershave sent her stomach into knots. She'd recognise that Hugo Boss fragrance anywhere. She'd spent the 2 years since Laurie's death inhaling it from the dregs of the bottle in the bathroom cabinet, with her eyes closed, and fond, yet heartbreaking memories charging around her mind. Determined to not let this spoil what could potentially be a pleasant evening, she sat and smiled, answering his questions about her journey and others that pertained to the usual small talk. The waiter had offered them a wine list, and Peter gestured to Juliette. "Oh, I think the lady should choose," he said with a handsome smile. She held up her hand. "Oh, no, it's fine. I'll drink most things." She cringed, regretting her words immediately. How to make yourself sound like a lush in one easy step. Peter had nodded and grinned. "OK, I'd better put my specs on then, or I'll be ordering a bottle of milk or something equally inappropriate." He chuckled and reached into his inside pocket. He pulled out his black-rimmed glasses and placed them on his nose. "Now, I've had the Shiraz here before and found it quite palatable. What do you think?" Unable to articulate her thoughts at that precise moment, Juliette widened her eyes and gasped. "Oh no, glasses too, and they're black, just like Laurie's. I think I'm going to faint." Her heart had thumped in her chest, and she'd rapidly lost the ability to pull air into her lungs. No words would come, and she felt the blood drain from her cheeks. She presumed the strange, choking noise was coming from her and could feel the eyes of every patron boring into her. Peter had leapt from his seat and rushed round to her side. "Are you okay, Juliette? You've gone so pale. Breathe, please, breathe." Panic was evident in his tone.
"Can anyone help?"
He'd shouted to the people uselessly watching the debacle unfurl in front of them. Stars had danced before Juliette's eyes, and the room had swayed to and fro as she'd gulped in desperation. The background music had seemed to lose its key, and everything became a strange echo. She'd stared at Peter, unable to explain why it had happened, or what the matter even was. She could hear people talking loudly.
"Is she choking? Does anyone know the Hendricks manoeuvre?" "It's Heimlich, Geoffrey. The Heimlich manoeuvre. Hendricks is gin, for goodness sake, you silly old fool."
"Could it be a heart attack? Should we call an ambulance?" Someone had thrust a paper bag into her hand, and a soft Irish accent had said,
"It's a panic attack. Here, love. Breathe into this."
A smiling older woman came into view as she crouched before her.
"Try to slow your breathing, love. In through your nose, out through your mouth. Nice and easy. That's it. You're doing grand. You'll be fine. Just keep your eyes on me and listen to what I'm saying."
Doing as she was instructed, Juliette's breathing began to calm, but she was then overtaken by pained sobs. A combination of embarrassment at the crowd around her and horror at the fact she had chosen to go on a date with a carbon copy of her dead husband. This only went to prove that she hadn't moved on at all. She hadn't made the inroads into recovery that she'd thought. She'd felt foolish and incredibly guilty for putting Peter through this whole disaster. The woman, who introduced herself as Linda Clancy, a retired mental health nurse, had comforted her and tried to reassure her that she had no reason to be embarrassed, that these things had a habit of creeping up on you, even if you weren't noticeably feeling anxious. Linda had tried to explain things to Peter too, but he didn't appear to be taking it in, nodding blankly as he sat there, pale and clearly shaken by the whole ordeal. Juliette guessed he was probably mortally horrified, wondering what kind of nut job he'd been set up with. Once she was reasonably calm and everyone had gone back to their own conversations, Juliette had excused herself to go to the bathroom. Once she had splashed her face with cold water and examined her blotchy, swollen reflection, she'd realised she couldn't face Peter again. He'd no doubt never call her again after this anyway, so she'd decided to make it easier for him. She snuck out of the restaurant and darted into the adjacent alleyway, finding herself in the midst of a torrential downpour. When Juliette finished recounting the horrendous evening, Millie reached across and squeezed her hand.
"Oh, honey, I'm so sorry I pushed you into it. I feel terrible. Here I am trying to sort out your love life, and I can't even find one of my own."
Juliette shook her head.
No, it's not your fault. I should have known better than to think I was ready. I thought 2 years was a good length of time to grieve. Although now I'm not entirely sure there is a time limit on such things.
She wondered silently to herself if, in fact, she would ever really get over losing Laurie. There were so many firsts for a married couple. First dance as man and wife, first anniversary, first child if they were lucky. But for Juliette, she was still facing all the firsts that come when you lose someone you consider to be a part of yourself. She would never get used to the empty side of the bed. When she woke each morning, the first thing she wanted to do was to snuggle up to her husband, only to be brought back to earth with a resounding thud when reality hit, and she remembered that would never happen again. She would never get over the fact that she wouldn't hold their firstborn child as he gazed lovingly at them both. because that chance had been stolen from them by his cancer. She would never get used to the times when something funny happened, and she was momentarily taken with the urge to text Laurie to tell him all about it, only to remember that there was no one holding his phone at the other end of the airwaves. She would never get used to watching a sad movie and having no one there to pull her into his arms, to soothe her sadness and kiss away her tears. Because now, all that remained was the empty space that her husband used to occupy, both on the earth and in her heart. The Laurie-shaped hole that would never heal. Millie opened her mouth as if to speak, but closed it again, and took a sip of her wine. Juliette could tell when her friend had things to say, and wasn't willing to let it go so easily. "Come on, Millie, out with it." Millie placed her empty glass on the coffee table. "It's just that the more I think about it, the more I wonder if you really did grieve. You threw yourself back into work. You carried on volunteering at the shelter charity shop on your weekends. You didn't really take time for you until your mental health forced the issue. And then you were so busy dealing with depression that I don't think you really had a chance to grieve." She possibly had a point. "I thought keeping busy would help. Clearly, I was wrong about that too, considering I almost had a nervous breakdown." After nursing her sick husband, Juliette had descended into the type of depression that consumes and devours. Medication and counselling had followed, but it had been a long journey. "Exactly. Maybe you need to really deal with it. Allow yourself some time away, perhaps." Juliette tried to make light of the situation. "You're just trying to get rid of me because I keep forcing my cooking on you." It was true. Spending time alone wasn't something she enjoyed, and she invited her older brother Dexter, who also lived locally, and Millie around at every possible opportunity. It was a shame her cooking wasn't improving in the slightest, even with all the practice. Millie laughed good-naturedly. "You know that's not what I mean. Maybe you need to head off somewhere warm and relaxing." "You mean like every holiday Laurie and I ever took together?" Millie cringed. "Okay, fair point. Maybe go snowboarding in the Alps or something then. But just take the time and space to let yourself heal. You nursed Laurie through his illness, but now you need to take care of you." Again, she was making sense, and Juliette resolved to seriously consider Millie's suggestion. In the short amount of time she'd had with Laurie, they'd sunk their toes into the soft white sand of Caribbean beaches and had experienced the pretty wooden huts and the crystal-clear, turquoise waters of the Indian Ocean. Perhaps a trip somewhere completely different was a great way of moving on, of becoming Juliette Fairhurst instead of Professor Lawrence Fairhurst's poor widow. As Juliette lay in Millie's spare bed later that night, she thought about her parents, how much she'd missed them since she had moved away from County Durham to Gloucester. How easy things were when she was a little girl, sitting on her mum's lap as she serenaded her with the enchanting words and tune of the Skye boat song. Her mum used to tell her many stories of her childhood growing up on the Isle of Skye, until her own parents moved to the mainland when she was 10. From a young age, Juliette vowed to one day visit the island of her mother's birth, to discover the magic for herself, and had talked about it with Laurie on so many occasions. Sadly, he was given a terminal diagnosis, which put paid to further holidays, even though he promised he'd take her one day. The following morning, Juliette was sitting in Millie's lounge, drinking her first cup of tea of the day, and she picked up a magazine from the coffee table. An article titled, "Does It Always Rain in Scotland?" caught her eye, and she thumbed through the pages until she reached a stunning photograph of the Cuillin Hills on the Isle of Skye. The backdrop of the naturally sculptured rocks was an almost cloudless cobalt sky. A lone person stood in silhouette, arms outspread, head tilted towards the sun, and a shiver travelled along Juliette's spine. It was as if the article was meant to be seen by her. It was as if Laurie was saying, "Yes, do it. Go to the place we never got to visit." And she knew she would listen. Chapter 2. The summer break was looming, which meant Juliette's hours at the university would be drastically reduced for several months. It was time she could use to her advantage if she were to arrange to take the whole summer off. And the more she thought about it, the more she realised that Skye would be the perfect escape for her. She knew no one there, so she could reinvent herself. But she still had family ties to the island, albeit historical ones. It wasn't a million miles away, but the distance was sufficient for her to need to rely only upon herself again. And most importantly of all, there were no memories of Laurie there to catch her off guard. Having emailed Peter the Sunday after their non-date to explain her panic attack and tell him that she was going away for a while, she received a pleasant enough response that eased her conscience. It turned out he, too, had realised that he wasn't yet ready for dating. Although she guessed he just wasn't ready for dating her. They ended things on a friendly note with the agreement to keep in touch. She knew, and she guessed he did too, that it was highly unlikely their paths would ever cross again. While still on the computer, she opened a new tab and searched for the village of Glentorrin on Skye, where her mother had been born. Her heart skipped as she flicked through images of the coastal village with its whitewashed houses and mountainous backdrop. Her mind began to whir with possibilities. Back at work on Monday, Juliette managed to avoid the whole conversation with Claire about why her date with Peter hadn't gone well. Apparently Claire had workmen in at home and spent most of the day responding to calls and messages from the foreman. Some of the calls became quite heated, and so Juliette decided that avoiding her was the best option. After lunch, whilst Claire was out, Juliette took the plunge and knocked on her boss's door. "Nancy, could I have a moment of your time, please?" "Absolutely, dear. Do come in." Nancy epitomised every stereotype going when it came to librarians. The one thing Juliette had promised herself she would never do, from her neatly styled grey bun to the spectacles dangling from a chain round her neck and the sensible shoes on her dainty feet. She was a lovely woman, but very serious, and on occasion dour in appearance. "How can I be of help to you, Juliette?" Juliette twisted her hands in her lap. "Well, the thing is, I'm thinking it might be a good idea if... obviously I understand if the answer is no, but..." Nancy tilted her head inquisitively. "My dear, whatever it is, please don't be afraid to just come out with it." Juliette nodded and inhaled a deep, calming breath. Okay. The thing is, I'd like to take a long-term unpaid leave of absence over the summer." She exhaled. There, it was said, out in the open, dealt with, kind of. "I've been doing some family research, and I'd very much like to spend some time in the village where my mum was born, on the Isle of Skye. It's a cute little place called Glentorrin. I've never been, but I feel a kind of connection to the place. Something's pulling me there, and... Realising she was rambling, she allowed her words to trail off. Nancy nodded slowly. She leaned forward, folding her hands on the desk. I see. I see. Can I be frank with you, dear? Uh-oh, this doesn't sound good. Of course. I think it's about time you did this. In all honesty, I was so surprised when you returned to work so soon after Lawrence's passing, especially seeing as you're surrounded by memories at every turn here. Your tenacity was admirable, and I certainly appreciate your commitment to your work, but really, no one expected you to just get on with it, dear. We're 2 years on, and I've been waiting for this day to come. I've left you to come to the decision yourself, of course, but I had a feeling you would, eventually. Juliette opened and closed her mouth, a little stunned by what she just heard. Nancy held up her hands. Please don't get me wrong, she continued. You're a most valuable member of the team, and we certainly don't want to lose you, but you must take care of yourself too. I think it's an excellent idea to take some time away. Obviously, I'll need to run it by management, but as far as I'm concerned, it's a yes. Well, that was easier than she expected. Oh, wow. Thank you. Nancy eyed her with curiosity. You don't sound convinced that it's what you really want. Juliette scrunched her brow. No, it's not that. I wasn't expecting you to be so understanding. Juliette witnessed a first. Nancy rolled her eyes. It was thankfully accompanied by a wide smile. Goodness me, Juliette, I'm not an ogre. The health of my team is of paramount importance to me. I would have hoped you'd known me long enough to realise that. Oh, yes, Juliette backpedalled. I didn't mean to insinuate the contrary. Not at all. I think I just expected there to be more hoops to jump through. Well, hopefully it should be a relatively hoop-free process. Now, let me have the date and the length of time you wish to take, and I'll see what I can do. Juliette sat in the window seat of her cottage, watching the children playing in the park opposite, as she chatted to her mum on the phone. Nancy was great about the whole thing. It was a relief and terrifying all at once, Mum. This means I actually have to do something now. Well, I think it's a wonderful idea, and I'm so glad you've chosen Skye. It's a shame we never took you there as a child. Your dad loved our family holidays abroad, though. Can you imagine if I'd insisted to your father, the sun worshipper, we should go somewhere where it rains a lot? She laughed. He's just the same now. Give him a pool and an ice-cold beer and he's sorted. She had a point, though. Dad loved nothing more than to sit under a parasol on a sun lounger with a good book while she and Dexter built sandcastles and ate helado and sandia. I do regret it now, though, her mum continued. All the holidays we had and not one to the place where I was born. She sighed. I've only visited since to attend a couple of family events when me and your dad were first married. It's such a beautiful island, sweetheart. You'll love it. So you don't have any living relatives there at all now? None that I'm aware of. There may be some distant ones. After all, your granny and grandpa grew up there, so there may be someone with a distant connection, if nothing else. Neither had siblings, though, so finding relatives isn't likely. But think of the fun you could have researching. Oh, it will be so wonderful for you. Do you have any particular place in mind? Juliette didn't need to think much about this. She was desperate to visit the village her mum grew up in. I'm going to try to find somewhere to stay in Glentorrin. There was a silent pause, and then she heard a sniff. Mum? Are you okay? Her mum cleared her throat. Sorry, love. I'm a silly old fool. I'm getting all emotional at the thought of you visiting my little village. I wonder if it's changed after all these years. Juliette wasn't sure what she would find in Glentorrin, but now that it was feeling a little more real, her stomach knotted with excitement. It was a good sensation, and one she hadn't felt since before Laurie had died. The following Friday was supposed to be Millie and Juliette's girls' night. Of course, Dexter, being at a loose end since his split from his girlfriend of 2 years, had managed to muscle his way in, and the three of them sat round the laptop at the kitchen table, searching the internet for suitable accommodation on Skye whilst eating snacks and drinking wine. Eventually, Juliette gave an exasperated sigh. It's no use. There's nothing in Glentorrin or anywhere close to it that's available for a long enough period. Well, nothing that I can afford anyway. She huffed and folded her arms across her chest like a petulant child. I'll have to rethink the whole thing. Devastated didn't cover it. She'd geared herself up to go away. The management team at work had approved it. Her friends and family supported her. But it was all a moot point now. Jetty, what about a working holiday? Dexter asked as he stared at the screen on his phone. The pet name he called her had stuck since they were tiny and he couldn't pronounce his new baby sister's name. Juliette scrunched her brow. I hadn't really thought about a working holiday. Why? What have you found? Millie, search up skyjobs.com, he instructed, and Millie typed the address into the search engine on the laptop. Now, click on the one that says Lifeboat House Museum. Again, she did as requested. Juliette's interest was piqued. Museum? What's that all about? Dexter nudged her. Well, sis, they're these places where people go to find out things. He guffawed at his own joke. Juliette whacked him, almost knocking him from his chair to a loud, Oi! Seriously, what does it say, Millie? Juliette asked, curious. Millie leaned towards the screen, cleared her throat, and began. Glentorrin Lifeboat House Museum is currently seeking a volunteer to oversee the running of the establishment for a period of 3 months. This will take place from the 1st of July and will finish at the close of the season on the 30th of September. The museum houses a unique collection of artefacts, not only connected to the old lifeboat and its crew, but also about Glentorrin and the wider areas of Skye. Accommodation will be provided and utilities are included. Please note, however, this is an unsalaried position suitable for a retiree or someone with the freedom to relocate to the village for the period of cover. An interest in history is essential, and willingness to learn about the artefacts is a must. Application by emailed CV with a covering letter, interviews to be held via telephone. All necessary checks will be carried out. It sounded wonderful, but Juliette was pretty sure she had no chance. They'll fill that locally. Why would they accept someone from so far away? Dexter pondered her words for a moment. Actually, they maybe won't get anyone close by who's willing to work for nothing. It's a big ask in today's economic climate. Juliette scrunched her brow.
No, I reckon someone will jump at the opportunity.
Millie, who had been silent since she finished reading the job ad, swivelled in her chair. Actually, Dexter might have a point. And you could always apply. Nothing to lose, really. And maybe he could stay here while you're away. She shrugged. Juliette thought about it for a moment.
What do you think, Dex? Fancy a change of scenery?
Hell yes. It'll be nice to live alone for a while. Living with Buzz is okay, but he has no concept of personal hygiene.
He held his nose as if to emphasise his point. Jacob Buzz Busby, Dexter's friend and colleague at the garage, had taken him in a month before as a lodger after he split from his girlfriend. Juliette felt butterflies of excitement come to life in her belly.
OK.
Why not? Go and open another bottle of vino while I email them. 20 minutes later, and with Dexter reading her email over her shoulder, Juliette hit send on her application. Well, that's it. Just a waiting game now. Juliette was already prepared to carry out more searches the following day, certain in her assumption that she would receive a thanks, but no thanks response. The following morning, Juliette was rudely woken by her landline. Her head was fuzzy, thanks to the copious amounts of wine she had drunk the night before, and her mouth tasted rancid, as if she had been licking dustbins. Not that she knew what that actually tasted like, but she guessed it was pretty close. She expected to hear her brother's voice when she reached to the bedside table and lifted the receiver.
It's Saturday, you know, dingbat. I like to sleep in sometimes.
Oh, my apologies. I can call back later.
An unfamiliar male voice replied. Juliette sat bolt upright, sending the room into a 360-degree spin that caused her to close her eyes immediately.
I'm so sorry. I thought you were my brother. Who's calling?
This is Reid Mackinnon. I'm wanting to speak to Juliette Fairhurst.
He had a lovely, lilting Scottish accent and a deep, gruff tone to his voice.
Speaking? I mean, yes, this is she. How can I help?
Good. I'm on the board for the Lifeboat House Museum on Skye. You emailed an application last night.
He replied, as if she should have automatically known it was him calling.
Oh, gosh, yes. Hello, I'm so sorry. I wasn't expecting to hear anything so soon.
Evidently. Anyway, I wanted to double-check your address. It appears you live in the Cotswolds?
She cringed before answering.
That's right, yes. But I'm hoping to visit the area and...
Ah, right, I see. Well, thank you for your application, but we're really looking for someone a little more permanently local. The last thing we want is to be left in the lurch if you were to be called back home for a family emergency or something.
His tone was terse and clipped. She scowled.
With all due respect, Mr. Shit, what was his name?
Mackinnon. Reid Mackinnon.
By the exasperation in his tone, she could imagine the eye roll that accompanied it.
With all due respect, Mr. Mackinnon, you could be left in the lurch by someone who lived closer. Surely it would make no difference to you the fact that they had further to travel home.
Silence descended over the airwaves, and Juliette scrunched her eyes tight.
Oh, I've well and truly blown that now. That's as may be, Miss Fairhurst, but we'd prefer someone more local. Someone with a genuine interest in the area.
She was surprised at how disappointed she felt at him brushing her off so easily.
Excuse me for contradicting you again, But I do have a genuine interest in the area. I love history, and my mother...
Really? I didn't see mention of your love of history on your application.
She heard a shuffling of paper and fingers tapping on a keyboard.
Well, it was there, along with my connection to the place.
She snapped, knowing instinctively that she wasn't making her case any better for doing so.
I see. Well, my apologies. However, we do have some other interested parties in the local area, so I'm afraid we won't be requesting an interview. Thank you for your interest in the Lifeboat House Museum.
It was clear that his mind was made up, and no amount of cajoling would change that. And in any case, if he were to be her boss, perhaps she'd dodged a proverbial bullet.
OK. Thank you for your call.
Feeling utterly deflated, she hung up the phone and flopped back onto the mattress, promptly pulling the duvet over her head. The next time she was woken by her landline, Juliette checked the clock. It was almost 1 PM. She figured she must have needed the sleep. Again she sat and lifted the receiver from its base. The room had thankfully ceased its rotation.
Hello?
She asked, carefully this time.
Jules, sweetie, it's Mum. I have some news.
Oh, hi, Mum. She yawned. What news?
Well, I made contact with Marjorie Dawson from church. She goes to Skye on holiday quite a lot. She's given me the details of a bed and breakfast place called Thistle House on the outskirts of Glentorrin. It's within walking distance of the village, and they apparently have vacancies for the first week of July. It could put you up, and you could find somewhere longer term whilst you're up there, maybe.
Juliette perked up.
Oh, Mum, that's great. Thank you. Give me the details and I'll call them ASAP.
The way things seem to get booked up there, I need to strike whilst the iron's hot. She'd call the bed and breakfast, and Mr. Grumpy Mackinnon could stick his museum. Chapter 3. Juliette sat in the chair before a huge gilt mirror. People around her were reading magazines and drinking coffee, their hair wrapped in tin foil. She felt like she was in some bizarre space-age cafe or a weird Christmas lunch vignette from a film noir. Charmaine, the stylist, stood behind her, running her fingers through her wet hair.
Are you sure you want it all off, Jules? It's a drastic step, especially with a change of colour too. I mean, brown to blonde is a brave move on its own.
Juliette inhaled a shaking breath.
I'm sure. I have to reinvent myself, and this seems like the perfect way.
New hair, new location, new me. She hadn't had her hair cut in so long, it was now midway down her back, the coffee-coloured strands a little lacklustre, to say the least. OK, well, I'm going to take a quick before pic for the Facebook page, if that's OK. People love these dramatic transformations. Juliette shrugged. Why not? Months ago, Juliette would have been horrified at the prospect of people seeing her and potentially judging her. Now, however, she was finding the prospect of these changes empowering, exciting even. Millie had offered to accompany her to the salon.
You hate being the centre of attention, honey. I'm happy to come and keep you company.
But she had refused point blank. No, I need to do this by myself, for myself. Thank you, though, but it's time I show everyone I can stand on my own 2 feet again. Millie had hugged her. My brave, gorgeous friend. With her antidepressants down to the minimal dosage, she had chatted to her grief counsellor on the phone the day before the hair appointment. He hadn't been surprised at all about her desire for change, which in itself surprised Juliette. He encouraged her to take the next step in her life journey. So, here she was, her hair looking bizarre in its tinfoil hat under an orange light, a pile of magazines in her lap. 2 hours later, Juliette stood before the same gilt mirror, her mousy hair replaced with shoulder-length waves in several shades of blonde. Just this one change to her appearance had given her a boost. She smiled at her reflection. "Wow, Charmaine, you're a miracle worker." She hugged the stylist, who happily snapped several photos for the after version of the makeover. With her stunning new locks and an unfamiliar but enjoyable bounce to her step, Juliette embarked upon a mission to purchase new clothes for her trip. Luckily, Millie arrived for coffee and, after gawking at her in a speechless stupor for a good 3 minutes, offered to help with the search. This was a whole new chapter to Juliette's life, and it saddened her that Laurie wasn't here to share it with her. But this was something she simply had to do, even though it meant going it alone. A few weeks passed like minutes, and preparations for Juliette heading to Skye were almost complete. Work had given her a tea party to wish her bon voyage. Gifts had included insect repellent and a transparent rainmate hat, which had caused great hilarity, especially when she had modelled it. She visited the cemetery to lay fresh flowers for Laurie and chat to him about her impending trip. "You'll always be in my heart, Laurie, no matter where I go. And I'll always wear my locket," she told him as she gazed at the lettering carved into the stone plaque. Walking away that day had been hard, and she wondered very briefly if she could actually go through with it. But she knew that she wouldn't just be letting her family and friends and Laurie down if she didn't. She'd be letting herself down. So she was determined to follow her plans through. Before she knew it, packing day had arrived, and Juliette giddily folded yet another pretty new sweater and placed it neatly in her suitcase with the rest. Rain and cold weren't things she was averse to. Growing up in a small northern mining village had meant she was used to puddles and grey days. But they didn't mean her childhood had been dull. Far from it. She had so many fond memories of woodland walks with her parents and Dexter. Bright Wellingtons and raincoats were wardrobe staples. As well as some scorching hot summers in her childhood, she remembered visiting the beach at Scarborough on wet winter days to build sandcastles and eating fish and chips on the seafront. Knowing this meant that whatever weather Skye threw at her, it would still be an opportunity to make more wonderful memories. These days, however, she was more of a ballet pump flats girl, but she had invested in walking boots for this trip. It wasn't a total step into the unknown, but she knew she had to consider her wardrobe carefully. She glanced up and caught sight of her reflection in the mirror. Her newly coiffed hair looked a little statically charged and dishevelled, thanks to the effort of trying on every item she packed. A deeply huffed sigh briefly distracted her, and she turned to where Millie sat, brow creased on the bed. "I know this is the right thing for you to do, but I'm going to bloody miss you." Juliette stopped packing and walked across her bedroom to her friend. She bent slightly, placed a hand on each of her shoulders, and looked her straight in her familiar green eyes. "I'm going to miss you too. But I think it's just what I need, and it's only a few months. It'll fly by." She kissed her friend's forehead and hoped Millie would think of a few months as no time at all. She turned and yanked open the sticking door of the large pine wardrobe, then stood, hands on hips, assessing her hanging garments with bewilderment. After a few moments of silence from Millie, she piped up again. I have to say, though, I can't believe that arsey man turned you down for the job. And I'm worried about you only having somewhere to stay for the first week. What will you do if you can't find anywhere? Will you come home? Juliette sighed. It was concerning her too, but the last thing she needed was to worry Millie further. I'm sure I'll find somewhere. Word of mouth is probably the best way, and I need to be there to hear of a place. If all else fails, I'll move on and find something somewhere else. Honestly, don't worry. I'm a big girl, you know. It was all rather scary, but a flutter of excitement skittered inside her at the thought of the adventure to come. Since Laurie had died, Juliette had felt as though she was living in a kind of bubble. It had been just over 2 years, and she still felt as though people didn't really know how to speak to her. It was as if they thought she was made of glass, and she'd shatter at the mere mention of his name. So they avoided her altogether, and she was tired of it. She wanted things to be normal again, to just be somewhere that no one knew her as poor Jules the widow. If only for a little while. Millie pulled her lip between her teeth and sat silently for a moment. I'm sorry, chick. I know how hard this last couple of years has been for you. Laurie's death was just awful. So bloody unfair. And I know I encouraged you to do this, but I don't want you to feel you have to run away. Juliette smiled and sat on the bed beside her. I don't feel that, honestly. This is the first thing I've felt excited about in ages. It just feels like something I need to do. Ever since I was a kid, I've been fascinated by Skye. My mum was born there, and when I was little, I didn't understand how she could have been, since there are only clouds up there. She giggled at the memory. When I realised it was actually an island, I built it up into this mysterious, beautiful place. And that silly meltdown at Alessandro's made me realise I just need to get away. Going to Skye will give me that chance. Plus, I'll get to see where Mum grew up. I can't quite believe I've waited this long, to be honest. Millie's eyes glistened with tears. Just make sure you come back, okay? Don't go falling in love with the place and buying a bloody house up there. Juliette wrapped her arms around her. I'll definitely be coming home, don't you worry. You can't get rid of me that easily. And anyway, Mistford is my home now. You're here, Dexter's here, my job is up the road. So, you see, there are too many reasons to be here. Don't you ever think about moving back up north to be closer to your mum and dad? You could rent this place out now that the mortgage is paid off. Juliette laughed and nudged Millie with her shoulder. On the one hand, you're telling me to hurry home, and on the other, you're giving me ways to leave. I can't keep up. Millie smacked her palm into her forehead. God, it does sound confusing, doesn't it? Sorry. I just mean, well, you relocated here for university, but I know how much you miss your parents. After Laurie's death, I think I expected you to want to go back home. Dexter moving down here made that easier. And I have you too, silly. Millie hugged her. You certainly do. And we've had some laughs, haven't we, over the years? I know how hard losing Laurie has been for you. And I miss the fact that you were always smiling when he was around. Perhaps this trip will help you regain that sparkle.
I really hope so, my lovely. Juliette swallowed the ball of emotion that threatened to restrict her voice. I hope so, too, she whispered. Has Dex said much since it's all been confirmed? Milly asked, turning to face the window and trying to hide the fact that a few tears had escaped her eyes. He's all for it. I think he'd have jumped at the chance to escort me, truth be told. Oh, he's such a good big brother. It wouldn't surprise me if he ended up going there too. That thought had crossed my mind. Juliette giggled as she folded another top. And I suppose getting away from things is on his mind since Brid cheated on him. I still can't believe she did that. All I can say is that it's a good thing they never got married. Dexter had been devastated by the discovery. The couple had been together for 2 years, and Brid had always seemed so committed to him. But it was evidently true that you never know what was going on in the background. Juliette had sensed that Brid wasn't the one for her brother, but seeing how hurt he was initially over the split had really upset her. I know, he didn't deserve it, but I think he's coping well now he's got used to things. Juliette paused mid-fold and pursed her lips as she contemplated her brother's situation. Although, when I think about it, he did seem rather too insistent about coming to Skye to look after me, as he put it. Maybe he's not coping all that well. A niggle of guilt tugged at her insides when she realised she could have been paying more attention. After all, he had been her rock through Laurie's illness and subsequent passing. Milly grabbed a pair of jeans and began to help. I should think he's finding it very hard to move on, especially as he sees her at work every day. I don't know why he doesn't just get a job elsewhere. Her mechanic brother had relocated to the area after Juliette's graduation, and he had met Brid when she had accepted the receptionist's position at the garage. I agree, but she's the one who cheated, so maybe she should bugger off somewhere else. Milly laughed lightly. Good point. Anyway, have you got something comfy to travel in? Juliette held up a pair of trousers and a sweater. Sorted. I still can't believe you're driving all the way to Skye. Can't you fly or something? I'm actually looking forward to the drive. It's part of the adventure, and the Skye terrain is exactly what Wolfie was created for. Jules had always adored her old 4-wheel drive, even if it did guzzle fuel. The nickname, while she was never sure how it happened, had stuck since she bought the vehicle with the money her parents gave her after university. Thanks to Dexter, a mechanic and lover of all things rusty and oily, it was almost a new car due to all the parts he'd changed. Milly grinned. So, how long will it take you to get there? It's over 12 hours, so I'm stopping off at Gretna to break up the journey. Milly placed her hand over her heart. Oh, honey, didn't Laurie always want to visit there? Unable to speak, Juliette nodded. Well, I'm sure he'll be with you in spirit, Milly said, and grappled her into another hug. Laurie's death had followed a year-long illness in which Juliette had watched him become weak and frail. The complete antithesis of the strong, handsome English professor she had fallen in love with. Before they officially met, she'd had to be satisfied with secret glimpses of him as he came into the university library to take out books for a paper he was writing on the literary greats. He was incredibly handsome in a classic way. Tall, dark hair, chiselled jaw, glasses, and broad shoulders. The day they officially met, everything. It was like something out of a romantic comedy movie,
and she loved to replay it in her mind and imagine some beautiful soundtrack playing in the background. From that ridiculously embarrassing first meeting, they struck up a friendship. They would visit a local coffee shop and share their love of books. He would advise on the best classic titles to read, depending on what Jules was in the mood for, and as a qualified librarian with a penchant for finding new authors, Juliette would share her love of modern literature, from the captivating story of loss in Donna Tartt's The Goldfinch to the mystery and scenery of Anne Cleeve's Shetland series. Her tastes varied, but the more gripping, the better the ride, she insisted. Despite her feelings for him, she never expected they would fall in love, especially considering there was a definite indentation where a wedding ring had once sat. But their friendship grew, and before long there were little signs that this was no longer just platonic. Laurie would find excuses to touch her, an eyelash on her cheek, a hair across her face. She would catch him watching her with a serene smile curling his perfectly shaped lips. Over time, Juliette discovered that Laurie was 36, a mere 10 years her senior, and was divorced. His dedication to putting in many extra hours at work had allegedly caused a rift between him and his ex-wife. But he promised he had made changes and learned from that mistake. He was a gentleman, a passionate and kind man. He encapsulated everything Juliette could have ever dreamed of, and he made her so happy. Fast forward 8 years, and their short but perfect relationship was in the past. 6 years together, 3 of which were spent blissfully happy as a married couple, and then a painful 2 years since, without him. Juliette had been a widow for a whole 24 months, 3 days, and 8 hours, and following her recovery from an almost crippling fight with depression, she had vowed never to let herself fall so low again. This trip was to be part of that vow, not least because lately she had felt like a stranger in the pretty little village of Mistford that she and Laurie had called home. Oh, how she had loved it when she was newlywed, with her whole life ahead of her, and how cruel it seemed now to be living that life without the man she loved. Her stone cottage had lost its warmth, the heart had been ripped out of it, along with her own. And she longed to revive both, but knew that without Laurie, it would be nigh on impossible. She needed a change of scenery, a different kind of fresh air, a new location to recharge her batteries and help her to decide what she wanted to do with the rest of her life, now that Laurie wasn't in it. She was too young to settle for the loneliness that had been weighing her down. Through counselling, she had discovered that 34 was no age to give up on life, and she was determined now not to do any such thing. Laurie had insisted as much when he was seriously ill. "Promise me, Jules," he had whispered breathlessly. "Promise me that you'll do something you love when I'm gone. Something that makes you smile. You have such a beautiful smile. Don't waste your life grieving and missing me. Go out and live. Fall in love again. You have so much love to give. Don't waste it. Learn to throw caution to the wind. Learn to fall like you did on that day in the library." His eyes had shone. "Promise me." She had chewed the inside of her cheek to abate the threatening tears,
and had replied, "I promise, Laurie. I promise." At the time, she hadn't meant it. How could she even consider life without him, let alone plan a future? So, despite her promise, her future had been put on hold as she fought to come to terms with her loss. But now was different. Now she was stronger. Not strong, but she was at the stage where she could smile through her tears when she remembered his wacky proposal in the middle of the boating lake at Mistford Park. Or when she closed her eyes and imagined waking up to find him smiling down at her, ready to take her into his arms.